Okay, let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you again for bringing us here together, and we pray that your Holy Spirit would be upon this place, would give us ears to hear and understand, and minds to comprehend, Lord, just the mysteries of your word and the depth of its impact on our lives. And Father, just the beauty of the imagery that we receive from it. And so, Father, just help us to hear and again understand, receive, and apply to our lives the importance of what we learned here tonight. And so we thank you, give you all the glory and all the praise in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, so again, we've got two handouts over here. If you haven't gotten a handout, come on up and grab. We've got two different ones. I want to start out today reading what I wanted to read. If you hadn't gone online and gotten this thing, I put this thing online. I think I just titled it Cyrus. But it really went with last week's, but I want to read it because I think it's just fascinating. Considering what we learned last week about the fall of Babylon, Belshazzar and the feast, and Cyrus's conquering of Babylon. This was written by Herodotus. Herodotus is a secular historian, ancient historian. What you've probably heard of Flavius Josephus. What Flavius Josephus was to say the 1st century BC, the 1st century AD. Herodotus was to ancient times. So, not a believer, not just a secular historian. And he records what he discovered was the story of the conquering of Babylon. And so he says, Cyrus then advanced against Babylon, but the Babylonians, having taken the field, awaited his coming. When they advanced near the city, the Babylonians gave battle, and being defeated, were shut up in the city. But as they had been there, long aware of the restless spirit of Cyrus, and saw he attacked all nations alike, they laid up provisions for many years, and therefore were under no apprehension about a siege. On the other hand, Cyrus found himself in difficulty, since much time had elapsed and his affairs were not at all advanced. Whether, therefore, someone else made a suggestion to him in his perplexity, or whether he himself devised the plan, he had recourse to the following stratagem. Having stationed the bulk of his army near the passage of the river where it enters Babylon, and again having stationed another division beyond the city where the river makes its exit, he gave orders to his forces to enter the city as soon as they should see the stream fordable. In other words, that they could pass it. Having stationed his forces and giving these directions, he himself marched away with the ineffective parts of his army, and having come to the lake, Cyrus did the same with respect to the river and the lake as the queen of Babylon's had done. For having diverted the river by means of a canal into the lake, which was before a swamp, he made the ancient channel fordable by the sinking of the river. When this took place, the Persians, who were appointed to that purpose, close to the stream of the river, which had now subsided about to the middle of a man's thigh, entered Babylon by this passage. If, however, the Babylonians had been aware of it beforehand, or had known what Cyrus was about, they would not have suffered the Persians to enter the city, but would have utterly destroyed them, for having shut all the little gates that lead to the river. And this is interesting because there's a passage in the scripture, I think it's in Isaiah, he talks about God opening the bars, opening the iron gates for Cyrus. Literally, I think it's in Isaiah 45. He talks about Cyrus, my handservant, who I have in my hand. He talks about opening the iron gates, because even though they walked under the walls by the lowering of the water, there were still iron gates. But for whatever reason, the iron gates were open. And in Isaiah it says that God opened the iron gates for Cyrus. Having shut all the little gates that lead to the river and mounting the walls that extend along the banks of the river, they would have caught them as in a net, whereas the Persians came upon them by surprise. It is related by the people who inhabited the city that by reason of its great extent, when they who were at extremities were taken, those of the Babylons who inhabited the center knew nothing of the capture, for it happened to be a festival. But they were dancing at the time and enjoying themselves till they received certain information of the truth, and thus Babylon was taken for the first time. And from a third-party neutral observer who just did the research, just that the issue of the gates and the issue of the fact that there was a party going on, which was recorded in the scriptures, and that this kind of stuff could be recorded with that kind of accuracy is amazing. So, what we're going to talk about tonight, pardon me for 1 second. Clicker. So we're going to be looking at chapters 7, 8, and 9. Daniel's vision of future world history, that's chapter 7. Chapter 8, the vision of the ram and the goat. Chapter 9 is prophecy of the 70 weeks. So we're going to have a lot of imagery here tonight. So just try to stay with me and try to keep your images straight. There's a lot of imagery going on. So what we have here, particularly in these 3 chapters, is the most comprehensive, detailed prophecy of future events found anywhere in the Old Testament. The purpose of this is comparable to this. David Gusick tells this sort of illustration. Excuse me. We've all heard sort of the illustration about how God sees the future like a man on the gate story of the building, watching a parade. The parade goes by, and so with that sort of image in mind, imagine, if you will, that you're on the street level watching a parade, and you're seeing the different things go by. And your phone call, and it's a friend of yours, and he says, "Hey, look up. You see the Goodyear blimp? I'm in it." And you go, "Yeah, you're not the Goodyear blimp." He says, "Hey, I can prove it. Snoopy is right in front of you right now. And after Snoopy is going to be coming the marching band from such and such high school, and then there's going to be a float or, some cheerleaders or whatever." He starts describing to you what is to come. And he's doing that to prove to you that he has a certain perspective on things. And as you're hearing this, and then as these things happen, now as he's saying it, you're still like, okay, I trust him, he's my friend, but I don't know. Let's see what happens. And as these things happen, it becomes more and more sure to you that he's telling the truth. So, as a few things have passed by, several things have passed by, detailed things that he was able to so accurately give, now he's continuing on, and he's telling you things you haven't seen, and now you're looking forward to them with anticipation. You're craning your neck. Where is that float that he says is coming? I know it's coming. I can't see it yet. He said it's coming, and everything else he told me is true. So use that analogy when we're looking at these kinds of things. That the prophecy is not primarily given for us to know the future. Prophecy is primarily for us to confirm the ability of God to tell the future by telling it to somebody in our past. And then we can look on it. When we talk about hindsight, we can look on it in hindsight and sort of piece the pieces together. Not like they do with Nostradamus. Something happens in the world, someone says, okay, let's, scour the quatrains and find something that sounds something. He said something about a building. So it has to do with the Twin Towers and, that kind of stuff. Not like that, but because it's got to fit. It has to make sense. And so we look back at these prophecies and we look at the details and the accuracy of these prophecies. And then we see that some of them have not come yet. They're like the parts of the parade that haven't come yet. And even though we sort of expected it, who knows, maybe your friend decided to, well, what's going on there? He doesn't really need to know. I'm going to skip a few things and I'm going to tell him excuse me, what's coming down, way down the road. And you have to decide, well, the things didn't happen in the exact consecutive order, one after the other way he said, but he got everything else right, so I'm assuming that thing he says is coming is coming. You know, so it's for us to look back, see the fulfillment of the prophecy, and then have anticipation, not trying to foretell the future. God didn't give us prophecy so we can figure it all out. And there's a verse in here that we're going to read that's going to explain that. The other thing that was brought up to me before classes, I want to put this in a positive way. I don't want to discourage you, I want to encourage you not to look on the internet for things about prophecy. Okay, because it's the one topic where every opinion in the world is out there. Everybody's bizarre, twisted view of things, and there are guys who just, you know, there are guys who are smart in the sense that they're able to grab all kinds of scriptures and put them together, you know, and make them sound like, wow, look at that. He's got it all there, it all lays out. But he's taking things out of context, he's taking things that don't apply, he's getting things out of order. When he lays it out, it sounds great, but the reality is it's completely inaccurate. And unfortunately on the internet, there's no way of knowing. You know, you're going to get everybody. So, you know, look to some authorities that you know. That, you know, Tim LaHaye has had some stuff out there. He's pretty good. Who's the other guy with his wife? Rexella.
Yeah, Van Ebben.
You know, his information about end times is pretty good. I'm not a big fan just because I think he spends way too much time on it. And he has a tendency to just to get a little bulldog on some people who don't agree with him. And I just assume, just stick to the word, just preach the word. But when he talks about prophecy, he's pretty good. David Jeremiah is pretty good. He's got a few little glitches, but nothing major that I'm not, I don't completely go. One of the things with David Jeremiah is he says that if you're not saved prior to the rapture, you will not be able to get saved after the rapture. That the only people that can get saved during the rapture are people who never heard the gospel before the rapture. He gives a semi-convincing argument for it, but I'm not buying it because to me it doesn't line up with other stuff. Perhaps it's true, I don't think so, but that's a minor thing. That's a small little thing that I'm not concerned about. I've listened to David Jeremiah. David Jeremiah does a great job on Daniel, does a great job on Revelation. You know, stick to some of the names you know. You know, at Calvary Chapel, I've been listening to David Gusick. David Gusick does a great job on some of this stuff. So just be careful. If you're out there looking online, you know, what about the 70 weeks? Let me tell you, everybody is going to give you their opinion about the 70 weeks. And they're going to use every kind of piece of numerology they can come up with. So just be careful with that kind of stuff. So we're going to dive into Daniel chapter 7. And again, we're going to try to move through quickly. We're not necessarily going to read it through, but we just want to cover it. It says the first year of Belshazzar. Now, bearing in mind that Belshazzar is the co-regent, he didn't actually become co-regent until probably about 3 years after his father, Nabonidus, became king. So, first year of Belshazzar was probably the third year of Nabonidus. Probably around 553 BC, which means that this event happens between chapters 4 and 5. Okay, we're sort of jumping around now because we're leaving sort of the consecutive historical end. Remember we said the first 6 chapters is historical with Daniel, and then starting in verse 7 we get into prophecy, and he's not terribly concerned with the the sequence of events. So, so we're sort of jumping back. You know, we were just talking about Belshazzar and the fall of Babylon. Now we're going back to just the first year of Belshazzar. Interesting thing, and this is something that David Gusick brought up, is just this phrase that he gives at the end of verse 1 is that telling the main facts. It just makes me think that he's just telling the main facts, which means there was a lot more to it that we didn't get. That Daniel saw a lot more, that he just wrote down the main facts, and that there was so much more to it that for whatever reason God did not inspire him to write down. It'd be interesting to find out what those things are. Someday we will. So he in his dream or in his vision by night, excuse me, he beholds the four winds of the heavens were stirring up the great sea. Now, just for imagery's sake, you know, the idea that the four winds, you know, wind sort of speaks about the will and the sovereignty of God. You know, that, you know, Jesus talked about how the wind lists and goes where it will, and, you know, and that we can sort of see the impact of it, even though we can't see the wind. And so it's an image of God doing what he will, what his sovereign will would be. We see the effects of it even though we don't see God. So we have the four winds. Four always typically speaks of the world. Okay? And so the four winds is talking about basically God's effect on man. So God is stirring up these winds. God is having he's causing these things to happen, this interaction with man, coming out of the great sea, and the sea speaks of humanity. You know, we've heard the phrase, the sea of humanity, right? And we hear things like the sound of many waters. You know, in Revelation, John says, I heard the sound, it was like the sound of many waters, and it was the sound of many people. If you've ever been in a crowded room, it almost sounds like rushing water, the sound of voices. So, and you also see in Revelation it talks about the sea gave up her dead, you know, the sea of humanity. So, so we're looking at what is going to happen in the world with humanity. And he sees these four beasts, so these four wild animals. And as we look at them, just as we saw, this is going to be, and we'll, it's going to line up with Nebuchadnezzar's image. And with Nebuchadnezzar's image, and it's going to be, we're going to see that it's going to line up exactly with these images. And just as the metals decreased in their preciousness, these beasts are going to sort of decrease in their majesty. Even though they're more powerful, even though in the way they play out, they're going to be stronger and do more, they're going to sort of decrease in their majesty and in their glory. So the first one we see is a lion with wings of an eagle. And you know, just the brief description we have here is pretty clear. Here's a lion with wings of an eagle. The wings are plucked off, and he's made to stand up like a man. He's given the heart of a man. So first of all, at the entrance of the palace in Babylon is guarded by winged lions. Okay, so we already have that image there. The wings are plucked off, a sign of humiliation, right? He's made to stand like a man, and we're already getting the image that we talked about last week about Nebuchadnezzar and how he was turned into a beast and then was brought up and given the heart of a man. What happened to Nebuchadnezzar? He was humbled to the point where he submitted to God. And he was given, just like it says in the scripture, about God will take away your heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh. Right? So we sort of saw that happen with Nebuchadnezzar. And it's pretty accurately described here in chapter 7 what happens with this winged lion. So then the next animal is a bear, raised on one side with 3 ribs in his mouth. Okay? The bear is not as majestic. I mean, the lion is considered, right, the king of the beast, the king of the jungle. We always think of, you know, even in C.S. Lewis, the Chronicles of Narnia, King Aslan, the lion, right? There's an imagery of royalty and majesty to the lion. A bear, we understand the ferociousness, especially if you're from out west. You know, you probably have, I mean, the black bears around here, you make a lot of noise and they run away. Grizzlies, not so much. And I'm sure that, you know, you live out in Colorado in the Northwest, there's all kinds of grills that they sell. You can see a grizzly, this is what you do. Because they're pretty ferocious animals. We know them we don't think of them as majestic. We don't think of them as glorious, you know, that there's something kingly about them, but they're powerful. So, here's this bear. He's sort of leaning up. We don't know if he's laying down, kind of on one side, or if he's sort of crooked, kind of leaning up like this. I mean, this just sort of adds one arm up, but he's, you know, he's leaning over. And it's giving the image of this unbalanced coalition of the Medes and the Persians. That the Medes and the Persians were coalition. They were partners that would conquer the Babylonians, but it was, I mean, the Persians really had the power. You know, and we're going to find out when we look at the next chapter, we're going to get a little more detail about it. But it was sort of an uneven coalition. It didn't take long after they conquered Babylon that basically just became the Persian Empire, not the Medo-Persian Empire. 3 ribs in its mouth. Okay? And again, this is some of the stuff that I've gleaned and I think is the best explanation. There's a bunch of explanations for this. The one that makes the simplest sense and the clearest sense is the best sense. So seek no other sense. The thing that makes the most blood without trying to wrestle the thing and make it, you know, say something that it's not. Very simply, Medo-Persia had to conquer 3 kingdoms in order to become a world power, become an empire. They defeated the Babylonians, they defeated Lydia, and they defeated Egypt. Those are the 3 nations that they defeated in order to become an empire. So it's likely that those 3 ribs that he's got in his mouth, he's devouring them. Right? The picture is that that this bear is devouring these nations, if you will, and that's exactly what Medo-Persia did. So more than likely, that's what the 3 ribs represent. So we move on, and this does, you know, this chapter moves on pretty quick with these animals. Doesn't give a lot of detail. Moves on to this leopard. Okay? So the next, we don't necessarily think of a leopard as a particularly powerful animal compared to a lion and a bear, or a particularly majestic animal. When we think of a leopard, we think of speed. We think it's fast. It lies in wait. It pounces on its prey. And it has 4 wings and 4 heads. So 4 wings is talking about speed. It's fast. Greece conquered the world essentially in 12 years. Alexander the Great conquered the world in essentially 12 years by the time he was 30 years old. And they conquered Persia in just about 3 years. Even though they were outnumbered by Persia 2-1. The Persians were a much larger army than Greece, but Alexander was a strategist, and he knew how to lie in wait and pounce on an army, to strike and then retreat. The battles between Persia and Greece were the bitter rivalry between the two of them is among the most bitter rivalries of all wars. And let me just. I think it's in the other one. It talks about the viciousness of that kingdom. I think, when we're talking about the goat and the ram and the bitterness and the viciousness, there was a lot of hatred between those two. And it was something, it wasn't like one decisive battle until the very end. It was strikes. First, the Persians actually started. The Persians went after the Greeks and were trying to subdue them, and then it was just strikes after that, strike back. And so this was Alexander's strategy, was, you know, almost like George Washington, the Revolutionary War. Let's only fight battles we know we can win. If we don't think we can win this one, we're not going to fight it, because they're too big, they're too strong. Let's win the ones we can win. That's kind of what Alexander did. He just kept doing it, kept doing it, kept doing it. So that's the four wings. And let's, just to give you a look, this is the Babylonian Empire. Okay, this is how it stretched. Babylon here, the capital, goes all the way into Arabia and even into Egypt. Okay, now we see the Medians over here and Persia over here. Eventually, this they conquer, and we look at this is Persian Empire. So the Babylonian Empire sort of went to about here, right? It didn't even go into Lydia. Right? The Persians came in, the Medo-Persians came in, took Lydia, took Egypt, took Babylonia, and had most of Persia. Okay? Then Greece comes in, and he has taken not only here in Lydia, which is modern-day Turkey, they already were in Macedonia and Greece and all that. They went all the way to India, and even took more of northeastern Africa. So they were at that point the largest empire that had ever been, geographically speaking. Now what happens, historically, Alexander dies of disease. They don't even really know exactly what it was. They say he had a night of drunken debauchery, and the next day had a very bad fever and was gone within a couple of days, and he just died. And this is when he was 32, so this is just 2 years after he conquers Medo-Persia. So the legend, you know, and there may be some truth to the legend, that they, as he was dying, as he was laying on his deathbed, they said, "Who do you want?" Now he had a son, Alexander. He had a son, Alexander. I think he was third or fourth, and who again was going to be just a child, because Alexander was only 32. So how old would his son be? And then there was another, I think it was another son or another relative named Philip III. And they asked him, "Who do you want to take power?" And the legend says that he said, "To the strongest." And so while his son, technically and legally, was his successor, his four generals, he had four generals that commanded his armies. They killed his son and they killed Philip, so that they would take power. And what they did is the four generals took power, and there was actually a fifth general, but he was very weak, and they defeated him very quickly. So in the end, it ended up being four generals that took over the Greek Empire. Now they didn't take it over as a team. Okay? They split it up. So you had in Macedon, which is basically Greece, you had Cassander, okay, king of Cassander up here. In Thrace, which is probably Bulgaria, probably up in here, and then you know, sort of western Turkey, was Lysimachus. Okay. Then we get into Seleucus. Seleucus had all of this territory. Okay, he had the largest area, and Ptolemy was the fourth general, and he had basically Egypt, Northeast Africa, And if you see what's going on here, I don't know if you can make it out really well. See how that looks kind of weird? Well, the reason why they did that is because, I mean, we all know what that little patch of land is right there. We're going to go over next week how that little patch of land switched hands about every other week for the next 120 years. Okay? That the what Seleucus, his sons took over for him, and they were called the Seleucids. Okay? Ptolemy and his sons took over, and they were called the Ptolemies. You know, their names were different. We're going to get into some of them, particularly next week. But they battled heavily over this little patch of land, back and forth, back and forth. Seleucids had it, but sometimes they're called the Syrians because there's Damascus. So sometimes the Syrians had it, sometimes the Egyptians had it. Sometimes the Syrians had it, the Egyptians, and it switched hands many, many times. So we look at this leopard has 4 heads, right? And representing the 4 generals, that this kingdom is going to be split into 4. And we're going to get into more when we get into the next chapter. Okay, but that's just so we sort of have an idea of what's going on. Now we have the 4th beast, okay, that is indescribable. He doesn't even say what kind. He just says a 4th beast, dreadful and terrible, exceedingly strong, had huge iron teeth, devouring and breaking in pieces and trampling the residue with its feet. Different from all the other beasts that were before it, it had 10 horns. So this is not a beast. I mean, down here, where's the back up here? They just sort of every graphic artist has some kind of different beast down here. This one looks like some kind of almost a dinosaur of some kind, or a hippopotamus or something with big teeth and all the horn, because we don't know. I mean, this is all the description we have, and the idea is that it's fierce, it's fearful, and it is powerful, right? So, and it says, considering the horns, and there was another horn, a little one coming up among them, before whom 3 of the first horns were plucked out by the roots, and there were, in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking pompous words. So this is a pretty bizarre imagery. Thinking that horn on the head of this beast is going to rise out, it's going to have eyes and a mouth, and it's going to start talking pompous things. Just a pretty bizarre thing. But just in verse 7, just the description of it, if we're looking at, again, like the parade, we're looking at everything that's happening, and we're looking at hindsight. Okay, well, we know in world history how things happen. We know what happened. Even if you don't believe one word of the Bible, we know that the Babylonians were defeated by the Medo-Persians. The Medo-Persians were defeated by the Greeks. And the Greeks split up into 4, and the next kingdom that was going to take over was Rome. And it fits. You look at the description. What was Rome like? Okay? That's Rome. We think of, what the other kingdoms look like. Right? They were kind of in this area. The Mediterranean Sea was called the Roman Lake. And you can see why. Rome actually started by conquering Sicily, then moved through Spain, took North Africa, while it still simultaneously moved this way, and then sort of met the other troops again, right in here. Starting with the conquest of Sicily in 261, they defeat the Seleucids in 63 BC. So 200 years it took them. Not like Greece. Greece did it 12. The Romans were slow. They were methodical. They were cruel. They had a different way of conquering a land. The Greeks, when they took over, they took over and they said, look, stay. We're not here to beat you up. We're not here to kill you. We're not here to destroy you. But you're going to become Greek. You're going to speak Greek. You're going to look Greek. We're going to impose our Greek culture on you, but you're welcome to stay exactly where you are. And As long as you behave yourselves, it's not a problem. Rome crushed people. They subdued people. They were just the opposite. They didn't care. You can keep your culture, you can speak your language, we don't really care. But if you step out of line, you're done. You know, obedience, absolute obedience, and they were brutal. And that's why they were able to conquer such a great area. But it was a slow, methodical, you know, until about AD 117 when it looked like this. It was at the height of its empire. And then it slowly, just as it conquered, it slowly disintegrated and declined until the official date is 476 AD, when the Goths sacked Rome, and it was considered, even though things sort of lingered beyond that. So we have that in history, except we have a problem with these 10 horns. Because there's nothing in Roman history that resembles these 10 horns. And again, there are those that try to find things. There are those that will go out there and will dig things up and will find, you know, 10 emperors of Rome in a row and say, these represent the 10 horns, and, you know, but then you're still going to get the other 3 and the one that rises up. Nothing seems to fit, and we're not going to stretch it. We're not going to try to press it into something that we want it to be. We don't see it in history. It's not clearly apparent, so we're going to leave it alone, and essentially we're going to find out that it just is coming later in a way that we don't understand right now. But we know that we've seen in the image that there is a relationship. There seems to be a relationship between this last kingdom, the iron that becomes mixed with iron and clay, and then this, this beast that seems to continue on beyond what we have in history. So, you know, if we look at this, you know, essentially we're looking at the major part of Europe, okay? So the speculation is that whatever this thing that's going to happen, these 10 kings, let's look to Europe. And as with any other prophecy, one of the keys to prophecy is look to Israel. Watch Israel. Watch how people interact with Israel. Because God's plan eventually always comes back to what happens in Israel. So it's interesting that even today, if you look at Europe's posture compared to the United States posture regarding Israel, that even now Europe is sort of backing off and telling Israel to behave themselves, telling Israel, and we've even seen things in just recent history, you know, where Israel's got to stand up and defend itself. And they're going to receive all kinds of backlash from the European states. And we also see, you know, that for those of us who've been around a while, you know, we remember Europe was a continent. We learned it was a continent made up of many countries. Well, now we've sort of seen this progression, you know, starting particularly with the common market, and now growing into the European Union, that these independent nations are sort of becoming one coalition again. And we're sort of starting to see that this Roman Empire it's not the same, it's not an empire, but it sort of looks, it resembles what used to be the Roman Empire in a lot of ways. So, you know, we're starting to see some of what, again, hindsight is helpful. You know, some of this stuff is just bizarre imagery with iron mixed with clay and that kind of stuff. But we still don't see the 10. And people have said, oh, it's this, it's that, it's the common market, it's the European Union. Okay, but you know what? We're going to stick with, the Bible says 10. Now we can spiritualize it. Say, well, 10 means judgment. 10 means, you know, something else. It just means a group of, a coalition of. You know what? I'd rather say that 10 means 10. Now, I know that horns is imagery. That's logical because it doesn't make sense that a horn is going to speak. So I know that that horn represents somebody. It represents a person. Horns stand for power. So it's going to be some kind of a leader, somebody in power. Old Testament would call it a king. Right? So some kind of a ruler, president, prefect, whatever.
What about the clay?
The clay, remember we talked about last week, probably is referring to how we sort of left the rule of monarchy and are drifting toward this more democratic rule. So, because it says mixed with the seed of men. So now we left sort of that single rule of a single monarchy to a monarchy with lords, to the Greeks, who had a king, had a general king, but they were founders of democracy. So they had a very people-oriented, until you get to Rome, which was led by a senate, a proconsul of a senate, eventually an emperor, but they still had a senate. And then it starts being mixed with the clay and, sort of representing weakness in a sense, but mixing with the seed of people. So what we don't want to do is we don't want to over-spiritualize it. He says 10 horns, probably represents 10 nations, 10 kings, so we call it 10 nations. 3 of them will be plucked out, removed, when this one rises to power, and this one is going to be somebody who is speaking blasphemies against God. Okay, and we're going to get into a little bit more of that. And then it says the thrones are put in place. The King James says cast down, but it doesn't mean cast down like thrown away. It means like they were laid out. The thrones were laid out. They were thrown down, like put in place. And it's because this is talking about now the 5th kingdom. The kingdom that comes with the stone that was carved out of the rock, carved out of the mountain, not by hands, that crushed all the other kingdoms, right? So, and then the kingdom is set up. That 5th kingdom is coming in. It talks about the thrones being set down. And it's interesting that it says thrones, plural, maybe representing the Trinity. That God is not, it's not going to be just one throne in a sense, because God is triune. Because it talks about the Ancient of Days. It's funny because it's like the commentators are like, they're all over the place. Because the Ancient of Days, usually, if you're going to get into Trinitarianism, if you're going to get into the Trinity, Ancient of Days typically is talking about God the Father. But we see the description, the Ancient of Days, his garment white as snow, and his hair and his head was like pure wool, and his throne was a fiery flame. Well, we go to Revelation chapter 20, and that's almost the same picture that we get. I'm sorry, Revelation chapter 4. When John is looking, he enters into heaven, he sees Jesus. And Jesus is on the throne, he's got the white garment and the hair like wool. So you've got God the Father, but it's describing him like Jesus. So, but if that's Jesus, then we look at verse 13. Behold, one like the Son of Man, coming in the clouds of heaven. He came to the Ancient of Days, and they brought him near before him. Now there's 2. So just like the Trinity, trying to figure out who's who and how they're all one, but they're all separate. We're sort of getting that here. That there is a oneness, yet a separateness in them. And then we see this thing about the wheels burning like fire. And again, I don't know what that means. Again, you're going to find a million opinions on what those things represent. We don't know for sure, except that we see it all over Ezekiel. He first introduces in chapter 1 about the wheel within the wheel. And then if you look up the word wheels, in Ezekiel he's filled with this imagery about the wheels in heaven, wheels. And we don't entirely know what they mean. It has something to do with rotation, revolution, but we don't know. And then he talks about in verse 10, at the very end of verse 10, the court was seated and the books were open. Another image that we get from Revelation chapter 20. The books are open. So we have this establishment of this fifth kingdom. And then the final thing that we see is the destruction of the beast. Watch, so the beast was slain, his body destroyed, and given to the burning flame. Again, Revelation 19. What happens to the beast? The beast and the false prophet are thrown into the lake of fire. Right? So we're starting to see some of this. When we get into Revelation, we're going to make some more connections. But we're starting to see some of this imagery that's repeating itself. That is representing what this fifth kingdom is going to be. So the last thing is this phrase, as for the rest of the beasts, they had their dominion taken away, yet their lives were prolonged for a season and time. Again, there's a lot of controversy about this. And this is where we have to sort of use language like we talk. Okay? Because people put this in consecutive order and say, well, this is after the fourth beast is destroyed. So it's saying that after the fourth beast is destroyed, then the other kingdoms are prolonged for a time. No, it's not really what it's saying. It's parenthetical. The fourth beast is gone, fifth kingdom is set up. Oh, and by the way, about the other beasts, what happened to them? Well, they were allowed to continue for a while. And we look at the Babylonians, the Medo-Persians, the Greeks. They were not wiped from the face of the earth. We have Persians today. The Iranians and the Iraqis are Persians, right? We certainly have Greek today. Babylonians, well, that's more like Iraq. I mean, these nations, there's still people living there. They were allowed to go on for a time.
Iran was still called Persia up until about 35 years ago.
So, and these people, and they still call themselves Persians. They consider themselves to be Persians. And so, what it's saying is, well, these kingdoms, their dominion was taken away. They don't have authority. They're not an empire anymore. But the people were allowed to, their lives were prolonged. People were around for a while until the end when all the beasts were destroyed. When the fifth kingdom comes, just like in the statute, all the other kingdoms are destroyed because the fifth kingdom replaces everything. Now the kingdom of man is over. Now we enter into the kingdom of God. So that's sort of what happens with that verse. It can seem confusing because it comes after all that, but it's almost like a parenthetical, oh, by the way, if you were wondering about the other beasts, this is what happened to them. They weren't completely destroyed at that time when they were conquered. Their dominion was taken away, but they were allowed to live for a while. So now we're going to move to chapter 8, the vision of the ram and the goat. Okay, now we're in the third year of Belshazzar. About 551 BC, about 12 years before the feast, okay, of chapter 5. About 2-3 years after this vision right here. And Daniel mentions that this is not the same vision. This is another vision that I received. And he sees himself in Shushan. And Shushan is where it says Susa, right in here. Now, he was not there. He was in Babylon, but in the vision, he saw himself in Susa, because this thing is going to begin with a prophecy about the Medo-Persians. And we see that when we get into like Esther and Ezra and Nehemiah. Where are they? They're all in Shushan, Shushan the citadel, right? That's where that was sort of the capital of the Persian Empire, was in Susa or Shushan. So the first thing he sees is this ram. Again, we get this picture of a ram, horns is power, but they're unequal. So it's like the bear on its side. Again, and like the statue with the two arms, we sort of have this imbalance, these two things going on. So we've got a ram pushing west and north and south. So let's look at the Persian Empire. Okay? First of all, they sort of come from this area. So where are they going to go? They're going to go west and north and south. They did go east, but the majority of their conquests, a lot of what they did east was they just sort of occupied that area. There wasn't a lot of resistance. Their conquests were gained for the north and the west and the south. Okay. Another interesting thing is that the kings of Persia, when they would go out to battle, they would not wear like a royal diadem. They would wear a ram's head on their head with horns, ram horns on their head. Again, representing power. So that became a symbol of the Persian Empire, was a ram. So we've got this ram, and now we've got this he-goat, or what's called a buck, the buck of the goats, the king of the goats, if you will. You know, he's the guy, he's the alpha goat. Okay? And are there any Greeks here today? Goat is a big thing with the Greeks, right? I mean, goat is like, the Greeks love their goats. It's almost a symbol of Greeks, you know? And so again, we're sort of seeing this picture of and they like to use, because goats are fast. And they're much more powerful than you. Have you ever been around a goat? I've only been around a goat a couple times. When I was growing up, we had some friends that had animals. They're powerful little, I mean, they're little things, maybe a little bigger than a dog, or about the size of a big dog. They'll knock you over without you even knowing. So they were sort of a symbol of the Greek Empire. They were fast, they were much more powerful than they looked like. So, and this one is fast. He's so fast he doesn't touch the ground. Says he went at the ram without even touching the ground. So we're talking about speed again, tremendous speed, right? One large horn, right in the middle, right between his eyes. No such creature as a goat with one horn, unless it's a mutant. Goats always have two little horns coming up, right? This one had one large horn, representing Alexander. Because he, even his father, Philip of Macedonia, was a great general, but nobody was like Alexander. And nobody was like him after that. So he was the one horn that represented the power of the Greek Empire. But the large horn breaks. When it's strong, it says when it's strong, the large horn breaks. It was only 2 years after Alexander had done this that he died. When the Greek Empire was at its pinnacle, its leader dies. The horn breaks. And 4 notable horns come up. Okay, we're seeing the same imagery again. Okay, only this time something different is going to happen. And it sort of sounds like what happened with the 4th beast. But it's not. This is not the 4th beast. This is Greek. The 4th beast is Rome, or a Roman-type government. This is Greece. So we've got this image of the horns, the 4 horns, but then out of it is a little horn from one of the 4 horns. So we go back to, here we go. Seleucus, who had this area, okay? He's one of the horns, right? We had Seleucus, Cassander, Lysimachus, and Ptolemy, right? Seleucus is one of the horns. From him, one of his grandsons is Antiochus IV, who called himself Epiphanes. And Epiphanes is, we even have, an epiphany is an English word from that, like a manifestation, a realization. Well, Epiphanies meant the glory of, right? Typically, like the appearing of Jesus is called the Epiphany. So he's basically calling himself deity. And it's interesting that the play on words is that the secret at the water cooler was that instead of calling him Antiochus Epiphanes, people would call him Antiochus Epimanes. Epimanes means fool. It sort of looks like it's more accurate, yeah. So instead of Antiochus Epiphanes, he was called Antiochus Epimanes. His brother actually was the one who was supposed to take over, but he killed his brother and killed his brother's son so that he would have to take control. he took power over the Seleucid Empire, if you will, right? And it says that he conquered to the south and the east and the glorious land. So the south and the east and the glorious land, right? Because they would come in here and they would take Egypt and then they would go back and then go back and forth. But the glorious land, Israel, was caught in the middle of all this, and we're going to get next week. We're going to get more into some of the details of that. And then it talks about because of transgression. Still talking about Antiochus Epiphanes. Because of transgression, what is that talking about? Well, here's something that happened. There was a high priest back in those days when Antiochus Epiphanes was in power, named Onias. And Onias was a pious man. He was a godly man. Well, Antiochus had no use for him because a man named Jason bribed Antiochus and says, I want to be high priest, and here's some money. So Antiochus said, fine, you're high priest, Onias, you're out, and made him high priest of the Jews. So Jason had a brother named Menelaus. Well, Menelaus wanted to be high priest. So he decided, well, I'll offer Antiochus a bigger bribe. So he offered Antiochus a bigger bribe, and Antiochus said, sold. Now you're high priest, Jason, you're out. Okay? Unfortunately, Menelaus didn't have the money to pay up on the bribe. So he began hawking and selling everything in the temple in order to raise the money to pay this bribe. So now Onias, the pious man, comes out and starts rebuking him. So Menelaus kills him. Then Jason is now mad because he's been kicked out after he paid a bribe. And he starts attacking Menelaus. And Menelaus calls to Antiochus and says, hey, you know, I'm your guy. You chose me. And so Antiochus comes out with his army and defeats Jason. And so all this is going on with, you know, within Israel, regarding the temple, regarding the position for the high priest. So, you know, when it talks about because of transgression, it's not just talking about Antiochus' transgression. These men were Jews. Menelaus, Jason, you know, these were Jewish men. They were not from Levi. They were not from the tribe of Levi. They were from the tribe of Benjamin. So they really shouldn't have been high priests anyway. So, now to top all this, and again, this is probably some stuff you've heard, Antiochus erects an image of Zeus into the temple, slaughters a pig in the Holy of Holies, gets pig blood, boils the pig with the boiled pig water all over the Holy of Holies and desecrates. And on top of that, kills a bunch of priests. Well, because of that, the daily offering is taken away. And this is what he talks about in here. The daily offering is taken away. And, you know, there's some sort of controversy about what these 2,300 days are. He talks about the 2,300 days in verse 14. For 2,300 days, then the sanctuary shall be cleansed. Right? That it's, you know, everything was put, basically the sanctuary is closed. No offerings, no oblations, nothing. Nothing's going on in the sanctuary for 2,300 days. We're not entirely sure what these 2,300 days are. This is where prophecy gets weird, okay? Because we can't nail this down. I've got something that I think, I've got two options that I think they're workable, because a lot of this stuff, you know, we don't have exact dates on a lot of these things. Some things we do, some things we don't, so it can be difficult to track. But a man named William Miller, about the middle of the 19th century, reads this and says 2,300 days. Well, that's 2,300 years, I think. So 2,300 years from this date, the temple will be cleansed, which means Jesus is coming back. I don't know what, you know, that's the kind of stuff that these guys do. They say it sounds great, but what does the cleansing of the temple have anything to do with the return of Jesus? But he made this assumption, and he calculated the days, and he told everybody, that's it, we're all going home, let's get ready. They put on their robes, they got on their rooftops, they stood on the hills, and that didn't come. He said, oh, I was off. Let me recalculate. We got another date coming up. And we've been seeing this today, you know. And it's, you know, we had the Great Awakening in the early 18th century. We had the Second Great Awakening in the late 18th century, early 19th century, and in the mid-19th century we had the Great Disappointment. That's what it was called, because it just didn't come. Now, this is what happens when people mess with this stuff, don't know what they're doing, and they're so sure about it, they're going to build a whole movement on it. Okay? Out of it came the Adventist movement. Now, a couple of things came out of the Adventist movement. Today, we have the Adventist Church, which, other than a few doctrines, isn't that bad. We have the Seventh-day Adventists, which I personally think they're believers. I think they've got some things, they're not, you know, they've sort of lost their way in some areas. They're not doctrinal in some areas. One of the biggest tenets of the Adventist movement is there is no hell. They don't believe in hell. They believe in soul sleep, they believe in annihilation, but they don't believe that people go to hell. Well, there was a man who really liked this idea. He didn't like the idea of hell. He sort of liked the Adventist movement. He liked the idea of number one, expecting Jesus to come. Number two, trying to calculate when he would come. So he decided to start a little Bible study. His name was Taze Russell. Started a little Bible study in Pennsylvania, and then moving up to New York. Started the Watchtower Society. Okay? So, out of William Miller tinkering with things that he didn't handle the scriptures properly. You know, a movement like the Jehovah's Witness was born.
Dun 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 dun.
Dun, 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 dun. Okay, so quickly, the two options I have for this 2,300 days, again, trying to make it as simple as possible, that the 2,300 days seems like it's saying from the time that the temple was defiled till the time that it was cleaned, 2,300 days. Well, we know basically when it was cleaned, when it was cleansed. It was about 164 BC in December, because the Jews today celebrate Hanukkah. Because that's what it was. When they decided to cleanse, they cleansed the temple, they lit the lampstand, the candelabra in there, the menorah. They lit it, but they realized they didn't have enough oil. And it was going to take them 8 days to create new oil, or to get new oil. But they only had like a day's worth of oil. So they just prayed. And the oil lasted 8 days until they had oil and they were able to read. Because they said, we're going to light this candle and it's never going to go out. It's going to be a perpetual candle. And the oil lasted 8 days, when it never should have. So the Jews celebrate 8 days of Hanukkah for that. So we sort of have an idea of when that happened. So if we go back 2,300 days, we can go back to 171 BC, which was about the time when Onias was killed. Okay, so it doesn't go back to the time of the desecration of the temple, but it does go back to a time when Onias was killed, when sort of the transgression really started happening, when this whole chain of events started getting ugly.
I'm sorry, who's Onias?
Onias was the pious priest who was removed because Jason the first priest paid a bribe to Antiochus. Okay? The one I prefer, there's a little bit of monkeying with it, but I don't think it's that bad, because you have to understand, it doesn't say 2,300 days. It says 2,300 days and evenings. Because to the Jews, they didn't count days like we do. They didn't say, well, today is Friday, it's Friday all day. They said, well, it's Friday, but there's Friday day and there's Friday night. There's two different things. You got Friday day, Friday night. And the night is not the day, and the day is not the night, but they're all Friday. So it's a little confusing, but that's the way they count it. So if we say 2,300 days and nights, does that mean 1,150 full days? because you get 2,300, it's not saying 2,300 days and 2,300 nights, it's saying 2,300 days and nights. So you get 1,150 days, full days. If you go back in time from the cleansing of the temple, from the desecration of the temple to the death of Antiochus is just a little over 3 years, which is 1,150 days. Okay? It's not exactly 150 days that we can know because we don't know the exact days. But it's somewhere around 3 years. 150 days is about 3 years and 2 months. And it was just a little over 3 years from the time that the temple was desecrated to the time that Antiochus dies. So that may be the most usable use of that time frame. Again, I'm not going to look for taking that 2,300 days and putting it somewhere else because it doesn't seem to fit there. Mark?
Also, the biblical year prophecy is 360, correct?
Right.
365.
Yeah, and also depending on how you do it, it could be that how you count it. We're going to get into that in the next one. Lastly, it talks about how this little horn is going to be broken without human means. So Antiochus was basically died of a disease, of a foul disease. They don't really say what. He died of some kind of foul disease. He wasn't killed by man. Larry?
Going back a little bit, you gave 168 BC to 171 BC for...
No, 164 BC.
164 to 171?
It's about 6 years.
Okay.
Yeah, that would be 2,300 days.
Okay.
It'd be somewhere around 6 years, about 6 years, maybe 3 months or something like that. Tony?
I was going to ask about verse 10 where it talks about the host of heaven cast down and some of the stars fall to the ground.
I think that's just referring to the priests that he kills. Because what did God tell Abraham? Your descendants will be like the stars in the sky. So I think it refers to the priests, all the priests and all the Jews that he killed, because he was brutal to the Jews. And plus, if there was a war, Maccabees. You read the book of Maccabees, the first book of Maccabees, it recounts the whole Maccabean War. All these events that happened, and a war broke out to where Judah, in the end, Judah Maccabee defeats Antiochus Epiphanes. Now later, Antiochus Epiphanes dies, and then the Seleucids come back and defeat the Jews again. But they managed to keep their temple this time. So, but there was a war that went on. A lot of Jews died in the process. A lot of priests died in the process. So I think it has to do with, not angels, but in this case, I think it's referring to God's family, God's people.
At the time of Jesus, that's why so many people were named Judas, was from Jews, not from Judah.
Yeah, a lot of people were named Judah back in Jesus' time because they were named after Judah Maccabee. He was a hero. It's like, modern day heroes. But, naming people after, a famous or well-loved person, right? So, last thing in this chapter, it talks about sealing up the vision, right? It's a sealed the vision because it's not going to happen for many years from now. This goes back to what I said at the beginning. It's not, he's telling Daniel, don't worry about what this all means because it's not going to happen for a long time and you're not going to understand it and you're not going to be around when it happens to look back on it and say, oh, this is what it is. Leave it alone, let somebody else look back on it and say, hey, look, and that's who we are. We're looking back on it and going, wow, look at how this stuff lines up. And we're not pushing, we're not trying real hard. We're just looking at what it says here and how things happen and just trying to lay some things out. Almost like you've got sort of a template down, and you're laying another thing on top of it, and you're seeing how it lines up. And there's some parts that don't, not that they don't necessarily line up, but this overlap where it's not an exact replica, but we see enough of an overlap, we see enough of a clear representation that we say, yeah, this lines up pretty close, especially some of the details. So And the last thing I think it's interesting that Daniel says, he says he was sick. It made, the image of this made him so sick. But he went back to work. He went back to the king's business. And just to preach for about 30 seconds here, prophecy can be a distraction if you let it. It's meant to reveal things to you, to motivate you to get back to the king's business. We should be about the king's business, not about studying prophecy. Daniel received the prophecy, and he was affected by it. He didn't say, oh, let's turn the page, let's get some more. It affected him so much, and yet he still went back to the king's business. And so, again, just a reminder that the prophecy is there for our edification, for us to look at, wow, look what God has said, and now there's this other stuff that we don't see that it happened, but I'm willing to believe that it's going to happen. Because like that guy in the blimp, he said everything else, and he was right, and I don't see the thing he said about the last time, but I bet it's coming, because everything else he said is coming. So, okay, lastly, chapter 9, amazing chapter. And believe it or not, we actually can get through this fairly quickly, even though this is a phenomenal chapter. Just because the first part, this is the program of God for Israel, culminating in the coming of the Messiah. Okay, he's just telling, this is what's going to happen, Daniel. He's going to tell you right now, everything's going to happen, and I'm even going to put dates on it. So, he's reading Jeremiah's prophecy. Jeremiah in chapter 25, 11 to 13, Jeremiah 29, 10, and again in Isaiah 45, it talks about God said, I'm going to bring your people back. In 70 years, I'm bringing your people back. In Isaiah 45, he mentions Cyrus, and he used Cyrus. So now here's Daniel. He's looking at his sundial, and he's going, hey, it's been pretty close to 70 years. And Cyrus is on the throne. And I'm reading in the scriptures, it's interesting that a copy of Jeremiah, the book of Jeremiah, made it to Babylon. All the way from Israel. And Jeremiah took off. Jeremiah, they say, he probably went to Egypt. He died in Egypt. And Baruch, who was sort of his scribe, wrote all the stuff down. Probably held on to the book, and who knows where it was, but it started getting passed around, and eventually ends up in Babylon, and Daniel's reading it. Saying,
only
hey,
one
Prophet
book?
Jeremiah. Was that?
Only one book? No other copy?
Well, no, I'm sure there were copies by then. I'm sure that, it probably wasn't the original manuscript. It was probably a copy that he got, and that's how it had. I just mean in the sense that it had traveled. Copies of it had traveled that far. So he starts thinking, this is coming up. Now, I want to talk about the 70 years for just a minute. We talked about how they had not kept the Sabbath for 490 years, so the land had not been allowed to rest for 70 Sabbaths, right? So God was going to give the land back at 70 years, at 70 Sabbath years. The calculation of the 70 years sort of gets a little fuzzy. Where's my doodad at the end here? Go back to that a minute. Okay. Where do we start? Where do we end? Okay. The 70 years, not the 70 weeks. I'm not going to get there yet. The 70 years. Okay. Some people say, well, it's when they first went into captivity in 605. Okay. That's fine. That takes us to 535 or 536 BC to get the 70 years. Okay. Problem with that is it says in Ezra 1:1 that in the first year of King Cyrus was 539, 538. Okay, where are we? So if you go from 605 to 538, you don't quite make 70 years. However, in 2 Kings 23:37, it said that Nebuchadnezzar came through and he made Jehoiakim his servant for 3 years. In 608, Nebuchadnezzar first came through Israel and made Jehoiakim his servant for 3 years. Then, in 605, he came and took the first captives away. So, if we say 608, that takes us to 538, we've got 70 years. Now, some have said, if you want to stick with 605, if you're married to 605, that's fine. Because some say that Cyrus did not become the sole emperor, that he shared the throne with Darius for 3 years, pushing us 3 years this way. That will get us to 535. So you go from 605 to 535 if you want to do that. Again, I'm not trying to play with it. I'm just saying, you know, we don't know, you know, God just said 70 years. He didn't give the date. Now we're going to get into dates. We're going to get into some dates here in a minute that are pretty solid. But he just said 70 years, and we don't know when exactly when the 70 years begins. It could have been either. But we can make 70 years work no matter what. However you want to look at it, we can make the 70 years, hit 70 years, just as God had promised. Now this was an interesting prophecy because Daniel sort of helped it along. Daniel sort of went to Cyrus and said, hey, look, your name is in my Bible. I just want to show you that, you know, about 150 years ago, this guy named Isaiah wrote your name in his book and said you were going to deliver us. So, and in Jeremiah, you know, he said 70 years, and we're right about there. So Daniel kind of greased the wheels a little bit. But then Daniel gets into this prayer, and it's a prayer, it's not a prayer, you know, he realizes, wow, we're getting to that point. And he's not praying, oh God, deliver us now, get us out of here, you promised you would. It's a prayer of repentance. He's saying, we have sinned. Interestingly, he says, we have sinned. You know, he's not saying they have sinned, your children, he's saying we. He's taking responsibility for it, saying we have sinned. And then he goes on, he lists the sins. You know, he gets into it, and, you know, we have not obeyed the voice of the Lord our God, you know, his laws that he set before us. And, you know, he just goes into a list of things that they have done wrong, and they deserve judgment. How God has judged them, but God is merciful. And the response to his prayer is Gabriel shows up and says, listen, when you started praying, I started on my way. And because you are beloved. He says, you are quite a guy. You are God's man. And when you pray, I get dispatched. And so Gabriel shows up and he says, instead of saying, your prayer's been answered, your people are going to be delivered. He doesn't get into that at all. He just says, better than that, because you're going to be delivered anyway. He doesn't say that, but the assumption is, yeah, I've already told you that. You've already been told you're going to be delivered. Better than that, I'm going to give you the plan. I'm going to give you the layout for the rest of history. So he talks about these things, that these are the things that are going to happen. He says 70 weeks, okay, for the finishing of the transgression, to make an end of sin, to make reconciliation for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, and to seal up vision and prophecy. Kind of sounds like the end of the world, doesn't it? It's done. Everything God has done with his entire plan is completed with these 6 steps, right? So when is it? And to anoint the most holy. And the word most holy actually says the Holy of Holies. It's not talking about Jesus. It's talking about the most holy place, the Holy of Holies. I'm trying the word. The Kadesh Kadesh is actually what it says. Kadesh Kadesh, the Holy of Holies. So it's talking about the temple, the anointing of the temple. So he says 70 weeks are given for this. Okay? 70 weeks, the word is Shabuah, which comes from Shabbat. Shabbat means 7. Shabuah is just the plural of Shabbat. Okay? So it just means 7 sevens, or 7 heptads. Okay? Almost like saying, if I said 2 dozen, you know that means 2 sets of 12. You know what a dozen is. Well, this is another way of, they didn't necessarily talk about a dozen, but a week, or a Shabua was a heptad. Okay? So 70 of these 7 years comes to 490 years. He says, in 490 years, I'm going to have all these things done. And that's all it's going to take. Okay? Now, we got to do some calculating. Okay? That a year is 360 days in their time. Okay, now you say, well, that doesn't work because you're gonna get way off, because we know that a solar year is 365.4. And even, it's not even that, because about every 100 years we have to get rid of a leap day because we throw the schedule off. So it's 365.4 takes us to get around the sun. Well, they were lunar. They went from full moon to full moon. So they had 360 days, and then every so often they threw in a month to make up for it. Because they knew that now we're off, so they threw in an extra month to make up for it. But that's a year, 360 days, typically. So 360 years times 490 is 176,400 days. Because if we try to do this using 365-day years, we're not going to get anywhere with it. The numbers don't match. But if we use this and we just say, this is how many days it should be, okay? And we're going to get to this when he talks about the 69 weeks. This is the crucial thing. 173,880 days. Because he says this. He says, for 1 week, right? Where are we? There shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. Well, we're going to find out in a minute there's a reason for that separation. But he's saying 69 weeks. Where are we? Knowing therefore that from the going forth of the command to restore and build Jerusalem until the prince, there shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. So 69 weeks, 483 years, or 173,880 days from the going forth of the command to rebuild the city until the Messiah. Okay? Now, what's the start date? You have a few options. Okay, 538, when Cyrus takes over, he tells the people, go back and rebuild your city. Have at it. You're not slaves anymore, you're not in exile, go back home. Okay? Rebuild the city and the temple. 517, Darius gives a similar order to go back and repair the temple. In 558, Artaxerxes sends Ezra back to finish the temple. But none of these are really talking about what it says here. This says, to restore and build Jerusalem, where are we? The street shall be built again, and the wall, even in troublesome times. In Nehemiah 2:1, Artaxerxes gives a command to Nehemiah to go back and rebuild the city, rebuild the streets, rebuild the walls. Very specific command. So that took place in 445 BC. Okay? Presumably on the 1st of Nisan. Because he says it was the month of Nisan when I set out. And it's presumed that he set out on the 1st of the month. Okay? So the 1st of Nisan in 445 to the 10th of Nisan in 32, in AD 32, equals 173,880 days. Okay? Now, we don't know. We have no documentation that says this was the day that Jesus died. Or rather, that this is the day that Jesus entered. Now, we know this. Jesus entered Jerusalem on the week of his death. He entered Jerusalem on the 10th of Nisan. We know that because it was Passover. We don't have the exact year. Or do we? Or do we look at this and say, this matches up. This lines up to what he's talking about. But the problem is that's 69 weeks. Okay? And don't get hung up by verse 26, when he says, you know, it'll be 7 weeks and then 62 weeks. And then he says, after the 62 weeks, the Messiah shall be cut off. Well, what he means is, after the 62 weeks, after the 7 weeks. So you have 7 weeks, he says there's 7 weeks, and then 62 weeks. And so, what he's saying is, he's just not repeating after the 7 weeks and the 62 weeks, he's saying, after the 62 weeks, the first 7 weeks, the first 49 years, that's how long it took him to rebuild the temple. It took him 49 years to rebuild the temple. So that's why he separates him here. He doesn't mention that that's why, but God gave him that breakdown, and it just happens to be a lineup that they completed the temple 49 years afterwards. So it was that 7 weeks, and then the 62 weeks, and then after the 62 weeks, then the Messiah will be cut off. Right? So don't get hung up on that verse there. Right?
Rick, wasn't that, to rebuild the city took that long, 49? Because they had troublesome times. The
Right, yeah.
enemy
with
kept
Nehemiah.
bugging them.
And yeah, that could have been it. It could have been the city, not the temple. But it says the Messiah will be cut off. That word "cut off" is a judicial decree for execution. It's a word that was used when they were going to execute somebody. They would be cut off. Okay. We also have Jesus on the cross saying, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And sounding like he has been cut off. And it says, but not for himself. He was cut off, but not for himself. You know, and it's interesting that in Luke, and I'm just going to read this real quick. Luke 19. After the triumphal entry. Right, triumphal entry is in verse 28. And then in verse 42 rather, Jesus says this, if you had known, even you, especially in this your day, the things that make for your peace, but now they are hidden from your eyes. Interesting that he chose that phrase, in this your day. And he's saying, this is the day. This is the day that Daniel talked about. You've known about this day. If you're just giving yourself to a little bit of math and figured it out, you would know that today was the day. And it's interesting that we were given that information and nobody caught it back then.
I think another one of the Gospels said the time of her visitation. And
Yeah.
it was not permanent, it was only for a short time.
Yeah. Yeah. So now we get back to Daniel real quick as we close this out. Right? Because now he's continuing on in Daniel chapter 9. You know, and after the 60 weeks, Messiah will be cut off, but not for himself, and the people of the prince who is to come. It's not saying the prince, it's saying the people of the prince who is to come. Okay, the prince who is to come is going to be referring to the Antichrist. Right? That one horn out of the 10. But the people of that prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. Well, who destroyed the city and the sanctuary in 70 AD? The Romans. Not, and I'm not saying this because of my own heritage, but not the Italians. But I say that seriously because it's not saying, because we'll start saying, oh, well then the Antichrist must be Italian. No, because the Romans were Europeans. You know? Go back all the way. I mean, that's Roman. You could be from anywhere in there and you're Roman. Paul was a Roman. He was a Roman citizen. He was from Tarshish. Right? Tarsus. And he was a Jew. And he was a Roman. So it doesn't mean Italian. It just means, let's just say, I just mean so people don't start going, now we know, he's going to be Italian. And, it's the Pope, and that's, and hey, maybe it is the Pope. Maybe it will be a Pope, I don't know. But that's where when people go, it says he's going to be of the Romans, and it's the Pope, it's got to be the Pope. Although this Pope is from Argentina, isn't he? So, anyway, it could be anybody that is of the Roman Empire, and it's just the people destroyed the city, right? And the end of it shall be with a flood until the end of the war. There was a war that took place, ended in Masada. The Romans took over Jerusalem. They destroyed the temple. They sacked the city. The Jews were dispersed, and a handful of zealots took up defense in a rock face called Masada, and eventually they ended up killing themselves. And it was a tragedy. You can read. Flavius Josephus, again, that was his big thing. The name of his work was called The War of the Jews. It was all about this. So this all sort of happened in the 70 years, or in the 40 years or so, following Jesus. But then we sort of jump ahead. And then he shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week. But we don't have that anymore in history. In the middle of the week, you shall bring an end to the sacrifice and the offering and the wing. You could say, well, bring it up right into the sacrifice because you destroyed the temple. But what is this thing about a week? We don't see, there's nothing in history that, Titus destroyed the temple. We don't see him making an agreement for 1 week. So, this is where we get into this. He sees certain things, You see the mountain peaks. And, you think, and it's like I remember a couple years ago, I was in Colorado, and I was driving out to Breckenridge from Denver, and you sort of see, I'm looking and going, look at those clouds. This flat sort of thing against the horizon. Like, clouds on the horizon. You get a little closer, you go, those aren't clouds. Those are mountains. They look very one-dimensional or two-dimensional when you look at it, and then you get closer, and you start seeing the three dimensions to them. Well, that's the kind of thing. And so there's a gap. It breaks up verse 26, and between 26 and 27, we seem to have a gap. Nothing seems to fit. So, we're still missing that 1 week. But then he says, he shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week. And it really says, the many. Or the word is rab, or the multitude. When the Jews left Egypt and headed for the Promised Land, they were called the Ereb Rab, the mixed multitude. Right? The Ereb Rab. Well, here he says, with the Rab. He will make a covenant with the Rab, the multitude. So he's talking about the Jews. So what we basically have is, God says, okay, when the decree goes out, and Artaxerxes tells Nehemiah, go out, rebuild the city, rebuild the streets, rebuild the walls. We start a stopwatch, and it's going. Okay, 483 years pass. Jesus is crucified, we stop the stopwatch. And we're on this time that nobody saw. Okay, and then we pick it up again. There's 1 week left to be filled out. Okay? There's 7 years that need to be lived out. And we're going to see later when we study Revelation that those 7 years are explained to us in what's called the tribulation. The great tribulation is the last 3.5 years. And we see here that he says in the middle of the week, or 3.5 years, he's going to bring an end of sacrifice and an offering. And so something bad is going to start happening after the first 3.5 years, in the middle of the week. And what we just read about a time and times and half a time. Right? Now he sounds like Antiochus. This, what we read about in the horn coming from the fourth beast, and what we read about this prince and the things that he will do. Antiochus is a type. When we study Antiochus, and we're going to get into it even a little more next week, he is a type. He was real, but he's also a type, so that people will know, just like Jesus said, when you see the abomination of desolation that is spoken about by the prophet Daniel, then you will know. So Jesus is saying it's going to be like that. Think of Antiochus Epiphanes, only worse. And that's what the Antichrist is going to be like. So Antiochus Epiphanes, we learn about, the reason we're learning about him is so that we can recognize who he will be. Now, I don't care about who the Antichrist is. People say, you think he's alive today? I don't know. Probably, because I think we're pretty close to end times. Who's he going to be? How are we going to calculate who's he? I don't know. I'm not going to be here. I'm not going to meet him. I'm not going to know. He's not really even going to be revealed. I don't think he's going to be revealed who he is until the tribulation is well underway. So we're not going to know. It's like people worried about taking the mark. Should I get that medical chip? Is that going to be the mark? If I get the mark, am I going to be in trouble? Well, we know one thing for sure. If it's not the tribulation, whatever you get is not the mark. Because the mark isn't going to be given until the tribulation. So if it's not the tribulation, whatever it is you're doing, it ain't it. Because we're not there. And I don't have to worry about whether or not I'm going to receive the mark, because I'm not going to be here to receive the mark. The people who have to worry about receiving the mark are those that don't get to know Christ before the tribulation. So, this explanation takes us, from the time where Daniel is, or really from 445 all the way to the end of things. And that's why we see this. Here's the 490 years. We have 483 here, across, and then 7 years, the last 7 years over here. I have 1948 listed here. We'll talk about that later. I don't know what that is. We see the church age is that gap between the mountains. So, a lot of stuff. Keep running late. Sorry. I'm trying. Questions? I know there's lots of stuff. And again, a lot of it we don't know. I don't care that I don't know about exactly what that 2,300 days is. I'm not going to kill myself to find out what it is, because if I can't find out what it is, if I can't figure out what it is in a pretty simple fashion, then I'm not going to bend my brain to try to figure it out. Because now I'm wasting time and doing this kind of stuff. Any other questions? All right, let's pray. Father, thank you again for the time you've given us. I ask that now you would just help us to understand these things, these great and wonderful truths that you've revealed in such a powerful way. And Father, we pray for those that don't know you, that you would think of our family members, our friends, people that we know. Father, they would come to know you before that day when they will have to endure 7 years of tragedy because they did not make a decision for you. So we pray for their souls now, Lord, and just ask for your blessings on us now as we go. Keep us safe, keep us awake. And again, thank you just for the time